The day Martha Ellen Crowley's own mother pointed at her in front of half the town and declared she wasn't worth a cow, most people expected her to crumble. Most people expected her to gather her shame like a bundle of wet laundry and disappear forever into the red dust. But Martha didn't crumble. Martha sat down on the porch of an abandoned post office, pulled out her needle and thread, and got to work. Then a quiet, broad-shouldered cowboy walked up with a torn jacket and a silence that felt somehow like the first kind thing anyone had ever said to her. And nothing in Red Dust Crossing would ever be the same again. This is a story about survival, about dignity, forged in the hardest of conditions, and about the kind of love that doesn't announce itself with flowers, but with presence. Stay with us until the very end. And before we begin, drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. We read every single one. The summer of that year had no mercy in it. Red Dust Crossing had been built by stubborn men and more stubborn women on a stretch of high plains that the rest of the country had largely chosen to forget. It sat in a kind of hollow between two shallow ridges, and in the good years when the creek still ran and the grass came up green in April, it was the kind of town that made you believe the West was worth fighting for. There was a main street of crooked boarded storefronts, a grain elevator that leaned slightly to the left like a tired man resting on his hip at church, with a bell that had cracked sometime around the turn of the century and now made a sound more like a tin plate dropped on stone than anything holy. There was a school with 6 rows of desks, a general store run by a widow named Haverford, who always smelled faintly of cinnamon and suspicion, and a bank with a face of pale limestone that looked colder than any other building on the block regardless of the season. But that summer the town was dying. The creek had gone dry in March. By May the topsoil was lifting off the fields in curtains, and by June what had once been farmland looked like the surface of something that had never known rain. The cattle were thin. The horses were thin. The men who worked the small outlying mines were thin, their faces caked in a permanent layer of reddish grit that had settled into the lines of their foreheads and the corners of their mouths so deeply that soap and water alone could no longer entirely remove it. Children played in dust instead of dirt, and it was a different thing. Dust, it carried no promise of anything growing. It just swirled and settled and swirled again. Into this suffering, someone with more optimism than sense had organized what the flyers tacked to fence posts called a community social and matrimonial gathering, which was a polished way of saying that the town's remaining unmarried men and women were being encouraged to meet one another in the square on a Saturday afternoon in the hope that new households might be formed and new roots planted before more families gave up and loaded their wagons westward. The idea, such as it was, had the support of the mayor and the minister and the banker and several of the older women who believed that the town's survival depended entirely on its people staying put, and that the best way to make people stay put was to give them someone to stay put for. The square itself was not a square at all, but an irregular patch of hard-packed earth between the post office, which had been abandoned when the federal mail contract lapsed 2 years prior, and the livery stable, which was still in use, but barely. Someone had strung a length of rope from one porch beam to another, and hung lanterns on it, though the lanterns were not yet lit, because it was only midday, and the sun was already doing its punishing work with a kind of indifferent thoroughness, pressing down on everything like a flat iron on wet cloth. The temperature had been above 100 degrees for 11 consecutive days. The air smelled of dust, and something underneath the dust, something dry and exhausted, like paper that has been stored too long in a hot attic. Martha Ellen Crowley arrived at that square not because she wanted to, and not because she believed in what the event was pretending to be, but because her mother had given her no choice. Vera Crowley was a narrow, sharp-featured woman who had been hardened by years of difficult circumstance into something that resembled granite more than flesh. She had lost her husband, Martha's father, to a mining accident 7 years prior, and in the years since she had developed the particular bitterness of a person who believes the world has cheated them personally and specifically, and who has decided to extract compensation wherever she can find it. She had 2 daughters. The younger Clara was small and quick-featured, and had been married off at 17 to a merchant's son from a larger town 2 counties east, which Vera considered her one great accomplishment. Martha was the elder. Martha was 26. Martha was still unmarried, and to Vera Crowley this was not merely a disappointment, but a daily affront, a walking advertisement of her own failure. It was not that Martha lacked intelligence. She was, in fact, one of the sharper minds in Red Dust Crossing, though few people had ever taken the trouble to discover this, because Martha's intelligence was not the kind that announced itself loudly. It was the kind that showed in the way she kept accounts in her head, in the way she could look at a piece of torn fabric and immediately see how it could be made whole again, in the way she noticed things, the lean of a fence post before it fell, the look in a man's eyes before he started an argument, the particular quality of silence in a room where trouble was about to begin. She was also, and this was the thing that her mother could not forgive and the town could not look past, powerfully built. Martha had the kind of body that the land itself seemed to produce in the women who worked hardest on it, broad across the shoulders and through the hips, with strong hands and forearms that had been shaped by years of actual labor, hauling water, splitting kindling, managing the mule, that her mother refused to handle, herself stitching and mending and lifting and carrying in a household where the work never stopped and the appreciation never started. She was not delicate. She was not meant to be delicate. But in a culture that had decided delicacy was the primary virtue of womanhood, her solidity was treated as a kind of failure. Vera had pulled her from the house that morning with the efficiency of someone handling livestock. "Put on the blue dress," she had said. "Comb that hair down flat. You are going to the social, and you are going to stand there and smile, and not speak unless spoken to, and try for once in your life to be appealing." Martha had put on the blue dress, which was the best she had, though it had been let out twice in the past 3 years, and the seams showed the history of alterations, if you looked closely enough, which people would. She had braided her dark hair and wound it at the back of her neck. She had said nothing because she had learned years ago that saying anything in response to her mother was like adding kindling to a fire that was already hot enough to burn the house down. They had walked to the square together in the punishing midday heat. Vera a step ahead, as always her chin lifted in the particular angle that meant she was preparing to perform dignity for an audience. The social had drawn maybe 40 people, which was more than Martha had expected. There were young men in their cleaned-up work clothes, dusty boots polished as well as they could manage, hair slicked with water, because brilliantine was a luxury no one could afford that summer. There were young women and not-so-young women standing in small groups, fanning themselves with whatever they'd brought, folded paper, the brims of their hats, their own hands. There were older residents along the edges, watching with the detached interest of people who had already placed their own bets on life and were now observing whether the next generation would be as lucky or as foolish. For the first half hour, Vera circulated with Martha in tow, making introductions that felt more like transactions, presenting her daughter with the slightly desperate energy of a merchant trying to move inventory before the season changed. Martha smiled when she was supposed to smile and spoke when she was spoken to, and tried not to feel the heat of the sun on the top of her head, like a physical weight. Several of the men she was introduced to found reasons to turn away quickly. She saw the calculation in their eyes, the brief assessment, and then the polite retreating nod. She had seen it before. She knew what it meant. She was accustomed to it the way you become accustomed to a scar, not without feeling, but without surprise. What she was not accustomed to, and what she had not seen coming, was the moment when Vera's desperation curdled into something public and ugly. It happened in the middle of the square in front of the gathered crowd, when a rancher named Delworth, A widower in his 50s, with a leathery neck and an expression of permanent mild irritation, was being introduced to Martha by her mother. He had looked at Martha for approximately 4 seconds, long enough to take in the full picture of her, and then he had smiled the tight, apologetic smile of a man declining a purchase, and said he appreciated the introduction, but he had some folks he needed to talk to, and turned away. And something in that moment, the ease of the dismissal, the absolute indifference of it, snapped something loose in Vera Crowley that should have stayed fastened. "You see what I am dealing with," Vera said, and her voice was not soft. It was never soft, but this time she pitched it at a volume that carried, that was designed to carry, because somewhere beneath all her calculation was the simpler and more shameful need to not be the only one who felt this humiliation. 26 years old, and I cannot give her away. Not worth a cow. A good milking cow brings better at market than this girl brings at a social. The words fell into the square the way a stone falls into standing water, and the silence that came immediately after them rippled outward in all directions. And then, because cruelty in a crowd has its own momentum, because there were people there who were hot and frustrated and frightened about their own futures and needed somewhere to put that feeling. The laughter started, not from everyone, not even from most people, but from enough. A sharp bark from somewhere on the left, a poorly suppressed snicker from a cluster of younger men, a few women who had the decency to look away, but who did not speak up. Martha stood at the center of it. She felt the words enter her the way a cold thing enters you on a winter morning, going all the way through before you have time to brace for it. She felt her face, and she made herself feel it, the heat that rose into her cheeks, the way her jaw tightened, the sting behind her eyes that she refused, with every particular particle of will she possessed, to allow to become tears. She looked at her mother. Vera's chin was still up. There was something in her eyes that Martha recognized after a lifetime of trying to understand it. It was not malice exactly. Not in the clean way. It was something more complicated and more sad, the face of a woman who had failed at the one thing she believed herself meant to do, and who was trying to turn her failure into someone else's fault. Martha looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the square around her, at the faces, the ones laughing and the ones not laughing, and the ones looking at their shoes, at the rope with the unlit lanterns, at the sun, sitting in the white sky like something that didn't care at all what happened underneath it. And she made a decision. She did not run. She would not run. There was a part of her, and she would not pretend otherwise, that wanted to. That wanted to pick up her skirts and walk in a straight line back to the house and lock the door and put her face in a pillow and feel the full weight of what had just happened. That part of her was real and human, and she did not hate it, but she did not let it govern her. Because something else was also true, something she had learned through the particular curriculum of her own difficult life, which was that the moment you ran from the place where you had been humiliated was the moment you handed that place and those people, and that moment, a power over you that you could never fully get back. So she turned away from her mother, and she turned away from the crowd, and she walked to the porch of the abandoned post office with the measured, unhurried pace of a woman who was going somewhere she had decided to go, which was in fact the only pace she had ever known. The porch was shaded. The boards were gray and warped from years of sun and inattention, but they held. There was an old chair along the wall that someone had left behind, whether from the days when the post office operated or from some period since she couldn't say. She sat down in it. She reached into the deep pocket of her blue dress, which she had sewn herself and had made with a working woman's practical wisdom, including the pocket, and she drew out the small leather pouch she had carried with her everywhere for the past 3 years. It held a packet of needles, 3 spools of thread in different weights, a small pair of folding scissors, and a beeswax block for running thread through before working with it. She set the pouch on her knee and opened it, and she took out a needle and a length of heavy-duty thread, and she looked out at the square. Some people were still watching her. She met their eyes one pair at a time, without expression, and then she looked back at her work. Within 15 minutes, a man had approached the porch. He was a miner, young maybe 22, with a jacket so badly torn along the shoulder seam that the sleeve was being held on by nothing but intention and stubbornness. He'd seen what happened. She could see that he had, by the way he kept his eyes carefully to one side, as he approached the particular courtesy of a person who has witnessed someone else's embarrassment and is trying to give them the dignity of not mentioning it. "You mend things," he said, nodding at her needle. "I do," Martha said. "What do you charge?" She looked at the jacket. It was heavy canvas work material, stiff with the specific grime of underground labor. The tear was long, and the fabric around it was stressed. It would take real work. "Lunch," she said, "whatever you've got." He had a biscuit and half a piece of cured pork wrapped in a cloth in his pocket. He gave it to her without ceremony. She took the jacket from his back, which left him standing in his union shirt in the midday heat, and she began to work. By the time the first man had retrieved his mended jacket, 3 others had appeared on the edge of the porch. By the time the afternoon had begun, its long slide toward evening, she had mended 11 garments, collected enough food to last 2 days, and had not moved from that chair except once to retrieve a bobbin of thread that had rolled under the chair. She had not spoken to her mother again. She had not looked at the center of the square again unless someone there made direct eye contact with her, in which case she looked back without blinking until they looked away first. The mockery had died down the way a fire dies when you refuse to give it air. Not with drama, but through the slow withdrawal of the oxygen it needed. This was the economy Martha Ellen Crowley had been quietly operating within her whole life. Not the economy of approval, because she had learned early enough and painfully enough that that market was rigged against her. But the economy of usefulness, the economy of things actually getting done. She understood that economy in the bones. She knew its rhythms and its rewards and its dignity, which was a plain and unornamented dignity, but was real. The sun went lower. The unlit lanterns on the rope stirred in the faint evening breeze. Most of the crowd from the social had thinned out. The event had achieved roughly what most of them had suspected it would achieve, which was a half-day of distraction and perhaps 2 or 3 introductions that might lead somewhere and probably wouldn't. Martha was working on the cuff of a laborer's shirt, a careful rehemming of a sleeve that had been rolled up and unrolled so many times that the fabric had finally given way at the fold when she became aware of a shadow falling across her work. She looked up. The man standing at the edge of her porch was not like the miners. That was the first thing she registered. He was tall and built, the way men are built when they have been doing hard work outdoors for a very long time. Not the hunched inward solidity of a man who works underground, but the open, straight-spined physicality of someone who has spent years under open sky. He wore a dark hat with the brim bent in the way that comes from 100 real days of weather, rather than the affectation of it. His face was weathered, the kind of weathering that happens in sun and wind, and not from age, though she guessed him to be somewhere in his mid-30s. His expression was not easy to read. It was not unfriendly. It was more accurately described as still in the way that deep water is still not empty, but quiet with something underneath that didn't advertise itself. He was holding a canvas jacket. The collar was almost entirely separated from the body, and the right pocket had been torn away, and was attached now by a single thread. It was the jacket of a man who had kept something long past its easy repair date, who had held on to it through practical necessity or sentimental stubbornness or some combination of both. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at her for a moment, not with the calculation she was accustomed to seeing in men's eyes, not with the brief assessment and swift dismissal. He looked at her the way a person looks when they are actually seeing someone rather than evaluating them. Then he looked at the jacket in his hands and back at her. "I heard you do mending," he he said. His voice was low and even with the specific gravity of a man who said what he meant and didn't expand on it without reason. "I do," she said. He held out the jacket. She took it, turned it in her hands, assessed the damage. The collar was the harder job. The pocket she could replace entirely if she had matching fabric, which she didn't, but she could stabilize the attachment so it would hold for another season at least. "This'll take some time," she said. 20 minutes, maybe more." "All right," he said. "Payment is food, whatever you've got." He reached into the inner chest pocket of a second lighter jacket he wore beneath the damaged one, the way men who spent long days outdoors often layered, and produced a cloth-wrapped package that proved to contain a piece of dense cornbread and 2 strips of dried beef. "That more than covers it," she said. "I know," he said simply. He didn't leave. He looked around the porch for a moment and then moved to the far end of it, where the boards were widest and the railing most solid, and sat down on it with his back against the post. He had a small piece of pale wood in his jacket pocket, light-colored and smooth-grained, and he drew a short knife from his belt and began to whittle slowly with the focused but relaxed attention of a man doing something he'd done for years. He did not speak. He did not look at her with any particular frequency. He simply sat there, in the same shaded air, making quiet, deliberate movements with his hands. And what Martha noticed in the next 20 minutes, while she worked her way carefully around the collar of his jacket and reset the pocket and ran her beeswax thread 3 times through every stitch for extra hold, was that no one came to the porch to mock her. No one stood at the edge and made comments. The few people who had been looking in her direction from the square turned their attention elsewhere. The large, still undemonstrative man at the end of the porch was not doing anything as deliberate as standing guard. He was not performing protection. He was simply present, and his presence had a weight to it, the way certain silences have weight, the way certain objects in a room change the character of the room by being in it. He had simply decided to be there, and the quality of that decision, whatever it was enough to shift the atmosphere around her by some degree she could feel but couldn't have measured. She handed him the jacket when she was done. He shook it out, examined the collar with the same unhurried assessment he had brought to everything else, turned it over and looked at the pocket, ran his thumb along the reset seam. "Good work," he said, and put it on. She expected him to leave. He did not leave immediately. He sat for another moment on the porch railing, finishing a few more passes with the knife on the piece of wood, then folded the knife closed and put both back in his pocket. "Name's Jesse Carter," he said, and tipped his hat in a way that managed to convey both the formality the gesture required and the complete lack of performance behind it. "Martha Crowley," she said. He nodded once, as if he was noting this information not for social purposes, but because it was accurate and real, and therefore worth noting. Then he stepped off the porch and walked away into what was left of the evening, his dark hat visible above the remaining heads in the square, for a few more seconds before he turned a corner and was gone. Martha looked down at the piece of cornbread in her lap and the dried beef beside it. She wrapped them carefully in the cloth he had brought them, in which she would return if she ever saw him again, and put them in her pocket. She put away her needles and her thread and her folding scissors and her beeswax block. She closed the leather pouch and set it in her pocket too. She sat for a moment in the old chair on the porch of the abandoned post office as the sun finished its descent and the first of the evening air came in from the east, carrying with it the faint smell of nothing just dry and distance. The lanterns on the rope in the square had been lit at some point while she was working, and they threw their yellow light in wobbling circles on the dusty ground below them, and there was something almost beautiful about that, the way light persisted in being beautiful even in the middle of difficult things. Her mother would be home. Her mother would have things to say. Martha stood up. She straightened the blue dress, adjusted the braid at the back of her neck, and stepped off the porch. She walked home through the early dark with the same even unhurried step she had used to walk to the porch, not dragging her feet, not rushing. An unspoken iron rule had been forged in her that afternoon, hammered out on the anvil of something she hadn't chosen but had endured. And it was this. No one, not the town, not the banker's cold limestone face, not her mother's sharp tongue, not the heat of 11 consecutive days above 100 degrees would tell Martha Ellen Crowley what she was worth. That was not information any of them possessed. That was information that belonged entirely and inalienably to her, and she intended to keep it that way. The dust settled softly around her footsteps as she walked, and the lantern light faded behind her, and Red Dust Crossing sat in its hollow between its two tired ridges under a sky full of stars that had no opinion about any of it at all, and Martha went home and took off the blue dress, and hung it carefully on its hook, and put on her work clothes, and started the evening chores, because the chores did not stop just because something important had happened. They never did. And this was the particular discipline of her life, the refusal to let even the worst of things steal the next hour from her. The belief earned through years of difficult practice that the next hour was always worth having and always worth putting to use. Outside in the dry dark the dust settled, and somewhere across town, in a direction she had not looked, a cowboy named Jesse Carter sat in the small room he rented above the livery and turned the piece of wood in his hands in the lamplight, and thought about a woman on a porch who had sown through her own humiliation with the steady hands of someone who had decided a long time ago exactly who she was and what she was made of. And something in his chest, which had been quiet for a very long time, shifted slightly the way ground shifts very faintly before something buried finds its way to the surface. The days after the social passed the way bad days often do in a drought, slowly with a weight to them that made the air feel thicker than it was. Martha returned to the routine her life had always required of her, the early rising, before the heat made movement unbearable. The hauling of water from the community barrel that the town had set up at the north end of Main Street after the creek went dry, the cooking and the mending and the silent management of a household that her mother presided over in title but not in practice. Vera had not spoken directly about what happened in the square. This was its own particular thing. Vera's silences were never empty. They were loaded the way certain rooms are loaded with furniture arranged so precisely that moving through them requires constant negotiation. Martha moved through them the way she moved through everything carefully without announcing herself getting done what needed to be done. But something had changed in Martha that afternoon on the post office porch, or more accurately, something that had already been true of her, had been tested under conditions she had not chosen and had not broken, and the knowledge of that, the quiet private knowledge of it, was something she carried differently now. It had no outward expression. She didn't walk taller or speak louder or look at the town with any new kind of defiance. It was internal, the way certain things are internal, the way the roots of a tree are internal, invisible above ground. But the reason the tree stands when the wind comes. She had also started going back to the post office porch, not every day. 2 or 3 times a week in the late morning before the worst of the heat set in, or in the early evening when it began to relent slightly, she would carry her leather pouch to the porch and set up her mending station and work. Word had spread among the miners and the day laborers in the particular efficient way that news of practical usefulness spreads among people who need things and have little to spend, which was without fanfare and without much language. Just the quiet passing of information from one working man to another. She charged food when they had it, and sometimes a small coin when they had that instead, and sometimes nothing at all when a man came to her porch with a look that told her both that his jacket was the only one he owned and that his pockets were as empty as the creek bed. She kept a running account of it in her head, the way she kept most things, and she did not worry about whether the balance was perfectly even because she understood instinctively that some kinds of accounting work on longer timelines than a single week. It was on a Tuesday, 11 days after the social, that Jesse Carter came back. She heard him before she saw him, or rather, she heard the absence of the noise that had been there before the low-level ambient sounds of the few people passing on the street, a cartwheel, a child's voice somewhere down the block. Not a silence exactly, but a slight settling, the way a room settles when someone with a particular kind of presence enters it. She looked up from the collar she was turning, and he was at the edge of the porch, hat in hand this time, which she noted. He was wearing the jacket she had mended. The collar was holding. The pocket sat flat against the canvas the way it was supposed to. He had taken care of it. She could tell, not with any special treatment, but in the way that a person who values a thing uses it correctly. "Miss Crowley," he said. "Mr. Carter," she said. He had nothing that needed mending. She could see that immediately. He wasn't carrying anything in the way that the men who came to her for practical purposes carried things. He had his hat in his hands, and he stood at the edge of the porch, and he looked at her with that same quality of attention she had noticed before, the kind that did not perform itself. "You mind if I sit a while?" he said. It was phrased as a question, but it had the quality of a man who was prepared to stand if the answer was no and would not make anything further of it either way. "Suit yourself," she said, and went back to the collar. He sat at the far end of the porch railing the way he had the first time and produced the piece of pale wood from his pocket and the small knife and began to work at it again. The afternoon moved around them. The heat pressed. A wagon went by on the street and left a slow trail of dust behind it. Somewhere beyond the buildings in the direction of the dry creek bed, a dog barked twice and then stopped. Martha worked and Jesse whittled, and neither of them said anything for a good long while. And what Martha noticed with the part of her that noticed things and catalogued them without making a show of it was that the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say and were enduring the lack of conversation. It was the silence of two people who were each doing something real and did not feel the need to paper over the realness of it with words. He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. By the third visit, she had stopped noting it as remarkable, and had simply incorporated it into the pattern of her working afternoons, the way you incorporate any reliable thing, not with gratitude exactly, but with a quiet acknowledgement that it was there and that it had value. He always sat at the far end. He always brought his whittling. He sometimes brought food more than was necessary for payment, a quantity that told her he understood she was feeding herself on what the miners brought, and that he had quietly decided to supplement it without making anything of it. He set it at the edge of the porch within her reach, and said nothing about it. He was not a man who talked for the sake of it, but when he talked, the words had been selected for a reason. One evening when the light had gone copper and long, and the worst of the heat had passed into something almost bearable, he said without looking up from his whittling, "How long you been doing this?" She didn't have to ask what he meant. "Mending since I was 9. My father's shirts first, then anyone who needed it." He nodded. She waited to see if there was more. There was. "You're good at it," he said. "Not just the stitching, the reading of a thing, knowing where it's stressed before it gives." She looked at him. He was still looking at his work, the knife moving in the small, precise rotations of a man who understood what he was carving toward, even if the finished shape wasn't visible yet. "You do that with land," she said. It wasn't a question. He considered this. "Try to," he said. "Don't always get it right." This was the most he had said in a single session. She filed it in the place where she kept true things about people and went back to her work. It was 4 days after this, on a Monday morning, when the heat was already sitting on the town, like something heavy and deliberate, at not yet 9 in the morning, that Jesse Carter came to the post office porch, and he was not whittling and he did not sit down. He stood at the edge of the porch with his hat in his hands, and the stillness that was usually a characteristic of ease in him was present, but with something beneath it now, the way the surface of water reads still, when in fact there is a current working through it underneath. Martha set down her work. She looked at him for a moment, reading the thing the way he had said. She read fabric looking for where the stress was. "Something's wrong," she said. He didn't deny it. He turned his hat in his hands once slowly, and then he looked at her directly. "Bank's going to foreclose on my ranch," he said. "End of the month." The directness of it matched him entirely. No preamble, no softening. Just the fact delivered with the same plainness he brought to everything. "The drought," she said, partly. He looked at the street for a moment and then back at her. "Partly Aldous." He said the name the way you say the name of a weather system you've been watching without personal heat, but with complete clarity about what it can do. Aldous was the banker. The man behind the cold limestone face of the building at the center of Main Street, a thin man in his 50s with pale eyes and the particular gift for arithmetic that in other circumstances might have made him useful, but in his current position made him precise in the way that a blade is precise, good at cutting exactly what he intended to cut and nothing more. "He doesn't believe I'll stay," Jessie continued. "Says I'm a drifter who got lucky with a land claim and will move on when the going gets hard enough. Says the bank's investment isn't secured without evidence of what he calls long-term commitment. And he defines that how?" Martha said. Jessie looked at her. "A wife," he said. "A legal marriage. Proof that a man's putting down roots and not just occupying ground." The morning was very bright and very still. A piece of grit drifted across the porch boards between them, pushed by a breath of air too small to deserve the name wind. Martha looked at her hands. The needles, the thread, the leather pouch sitting open on her knee. "That's why you've been coming here," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a working out of a problem, the same tone she used when she was tracing a seam to find where it had given way. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Not entirely." He said it with the same plainness he said everything, and something in the flatness of his honesty was more convincing than any elaboration could have been. "I came back because I watched you sit down on this porch and go to work," he said, "and I had not seen anyone do a harder thing that week in that town under those conditions, and I wanted to know the kind of person who could do it." She held this. She did not look away from him. She was not in this moment afraid of what he was going to say, because she had already understood the shape of what was coming, and she was the kind of person who preferred to see a thing clearly rather than look at it sideways. "So ask me," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I need a wife to satisfy the bank's condition," he said. "I need someone who will sign a legal document and share the ranch address and be willing to stand in front of Aldous and whatever witnesses he requires and say she intends to stay." He paused. "I am not offering you romance, Miss Crowley. I am not going to pretend this is something it isn't. What I am offering you is a roof that is not your mother's roof. A piece of land that has real water underneath it that I haven't found yet, but I know is there. Work that is honest and harder than what you're doing now, but work where the results belong to you as much as to me." He turned his hat in his hands once more. "And I am offering you a partner who has watched you for 3 weeks and has not once seen you quit." The silence after this was different from their working silences. It had mass. Martha looked down at the porch boards. Then she looked at the street, at the dry and baking town that had laughed at her at the direction of her mother's house, invisible behind the storefronts, but present the way a bad smell is present even when you can't see its source. She looked back at Jessie Carter. "Tell me about the land," she said. He told her. He described it with the spare accuracy of a man who had spent years learning to see landscape the way other men learn to read books, as something with meaning in every detail if you understood the language. His ranch sat 6 miles south of Red Dust Crossing against the lower ridge. He had 430 acres, mostly dry grazing land now, but with a creek bed that had run strong within recent memory, and a particular formation of rock along the south boundary that he had always believed indicated the presence of water beneath the surface. He ran what remained of his cattle herd 43. Head down from 98 at the start of the drought. He had a main cabin and a small barn and a root cellar that had been dug well and ran deep and stayed cool. He had been on the land for 7 years. "Why did Aldous loan to you in the first place," she said, "if he thought you'd leave?" Something moved through Jesse's expression, not quite amusement. "He didn't think I'd last long enough to be a problem," he said. "When I outlasted his expectations, he moved the goalpost." This was the most complicated thing he had said, and it told her something she had already guessed, which was that Aldous's issue with Jesse Carter was not purely about the drought or the loan. There was something personal in it, or rather something territorial, the particular antagonism of a man who controls a town's money supply for any person who operates by a different set of rules and answers to a different authority. "When do you need an answer?" she said. "Aldous wants documentation by the end of the week," he said. "A marriage certificate filed with the county seat and a statement of shared residency." She thought about her mother's house. She thought about the morning 3 weeks ago in the square. She thought about Vera's loaded silences and the way she moved through rooms as though the space belonged to her and everyone else in it was a guest whose welcome was perpetually under review. She thought about a root cellar that ran deep and stayed cool, about 430 acres of land with water hidden somewhere beneath it, about a man who had watched her for 3 weeks and said without decoration that he had not seen her quit. She did not think long. "My conditions," she said. He nodded as if this was the obvious and correct response. "Name them." "This is a contract," she said. "We treat it like one. I will sign what needs signing. I will stand where I need to stand. I will do the work of the ranch as a full partner, not as a hired hand and not as a fixture. What I contribute is mine to contribute. What I decide is mine to decide within my own domain." She looked at him evenly. "If the time comes when this arrangement no longer serves what it needs to serve, we discuss it like two people who made a business agreement, not like something else. No false pretense between us. Not now, and not later." He listened to all of this without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "Agreed." "One more thing," she said. "All right. I will not be introduced to Aldous as anything other than your wife," she said. "Not your temporary solution, not your contingency plan. Your wife. If we are going to do this, we do it without apology." Jesse looked at her for a moment, and what was in his expression was harder to name than any of the other things she had read there. It was something that had the quality of recognition, the look of a person who has been searching for a particular kind of thing for a long time and has found it in a place and form they did not exactly expect. "Without apology," he said, and it was an agreement and also something else, a statement of alignment between two people who had both been required in their different ways to apologize for simply existing as they were and who were both finished with it. They were married 2 days later. The ceremony was performed by a traveling justice of the peace who passed through Red Dust Crossing on his bi-monthly circuit and who had married people under more unusual circumstances than this, without commentary, which was one of the qualifications for his line of work. It took 11 minutes. There were no flowers, and no gathering of well-wishers, and no wedding meal. There was a document with both their signatures on it, and the seal of the county. And there was an exchange of plain words before a legal witness, and there was at the end of it the brief, formal pressure of Jessie's hand on hers as they both signed a dry, calloused, unhurried pressure that was nothing romantic and was somehow still a thing. They went to the bank that same afternoon. Aldous' office occupied the corner room of the limestone building, and it had the quality that power often cultivates in its spaces, a deliberate austerity. Bare walls, a large desk, 2 chairs positioned across from it at a slight disadvantage of height, so that whoever sat in them was looking upward at whoever sat behind it. He was a thin man with careful hands and the slightly glazed eyes of someone who had long since stopped looking at people and had replaced that activity with looking at what they represented in numerical terms. He looked at Martha the way he looked at line items. She let him. She had been looked at in worse ways by people with fewer reasons. He examined the marriage certificate with the attention of someone looking for a reason to refuse it and found none because there wasn't one. The seal was correct. The signatures were witnessed. The document was exactly what it was required to be. "Mrs. Carter," he said finally, and the name was a question dressed as a statement. "Yes," Martha said. She said it with the same quiet, unqualified certainty she had brought to the porch 3 weeks ago and to every morning of hard work before and since. The same tone that said the question had been asked and answered and was now closed. Aldous looked at Jessie. Jessie looked back at him with the same expression he brought to weather, acknowledging it without being governed by it. The banker reorganized the papers on his desk. He extended the loan terms. He did not do it graciously because graciousness was not in his register, but he did it because the document in front of him left him no alternative, and in the end, that was all that was required. Martha and Jessie walked out of the limestone building into the flat white light of the afternoon, and the door closed behind them with the firm click of a thing that had been settled. They stood on the step for a moment side by side, looking at the street. "Wagons at the livery," Jessie said. "I'll load what you need from your mother's house, and we can be at the ranch before dark." Martha had very little that needed loading. She had 2 dresses and her work clothes and her leather pouch, and a small box of her father's things that she had kept in the back of the wardrobe for 7 years. The things her mother had told her she was free to take, in a voice stripped of everything in the meeting that had lasted 4 minutes and consisted of almost no words from Martha at all, and a great many from Vera, none of which had landed where they were aimed, because Martha had already moved to a different position, one that was harder to hit. She picked up the box of her father's things last. It was small, the size of a book, and held a pocket watch that no longer ran a photograph taken sometime in the late part of the previous century of a man and woman in formal clothes looking at the camera with the deliberate gravity that early photographs required, and a folded paper with a few lines written on it in her father's handwriting that she had memorized long ago and still read sometimes in the way you return to something not because you've forgotten it, but because the act of returning matters. She put it in her coat pocket and walked out of her mother's house. Vera was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had the expression of a person who has miscalculated and is looking for a way to reframe the miscalculation as something other than what it was. Martha paused at the door. She looked at her mother for a moment with the full, clear-eyed regard of a woman who had thought this moment through and decided what it would be. "I hope the drought breaks for you," she said. And then she opened the door and walked out. She did not look back, not because she had no feeling about what was behind her, but because the direction that mattered now was forward 6 miles south along a red dust road toward a piece of land with water hidden somewhere under it, and 43 head of cattle and a root cellar that ran deep toward a life that was entirely exclusively, and for the first time hers, to build. Jessie was waiting with the wagon at the end of the street. He didn't say anything when she climbed up to the seat. He handed her the reins for a moment while he arranged the small bundle of her belongings in the wagon bed with the same practical care he brought to everything, and then he took the reins back and clicked to the horse, and they moved. The town fell away behind them. The road was red and the sky was white, and the land on either side of them was the particular desolate beauty of a place that had been tested past what it thought it could survive, and was still, in spite of everything, managing to be something still holding its shape, still present under the weight of the heat and the dust and the absence of rain. Martha looked straight ahead. She didn't know yet what Jesse Carter was made of. Not really. Not the way you know a person when you've worked beside them in the difficult hours. She didn't know if the water was really there beneath his land. She didn't know if 43 head of cattle could hold until the drought broke, or if the drought would break at all. What she knew was the leather pouch in her pocket, the needles and the thread and the beeswax block, and she knew the particular quality of silence she had already discovered existed between herself and this man. A silence where work was possible, where thought was possible, where a person could simply be what they were without spending energy on the performance of being something else. It was not nothing. In the life Martha Crowley had lived, a silence like that was not nothing at all. The wagon rolled south in the red afternoon, and the dust rose behind them and settled, and the town of Red Dust Crossing grew small and then smaller, and then disappeared behind the curve of the ridge, and ahead of them the land opened out in the way that land does when a town stops interrupting it, vast and dry and difficult and real. Martha put her hand in her coat pocket and touched the small box with her father's things in it. She did not open it. She just rested her fingers on it for a moment, the way you rest your hand on something solid when the ground under your feet is uncertain. Not because you need to hold on, but because the contact is real, and real is what you go by when everything else is still being worked out. The ranch came into view as the sun was finishing its descent behind the western ridge, throwing the last of its light in long, flat angles across the land, so that everything cast a shadow 3 times its actual length. Martha saw at first as a dark shape against the red-lit ground, a low cabin with a covered porch, a barn setback, and to the left a fence line running out in both directions from the barn until it disappeared into the failing light. There was a windmill still because there was no wind, its blades locked in place against the pale sky. There was a water tank beneath it that she could see from the wagon was not more than a quarter full. There was a stand of 3 cottonwood trees near the cabin, and they were alive barely, their leaves small and curled inward from the heat, but alive, which told her something about the soil in that particular spot, that it held moisture longer than the surrounding ground, that beneath those roots there was something worth holding on to. Jesse pulled the wagon up to the cabin and set the brake. He climbed down and came around to her side, and stood there, not offering his hand in any dramatic way, but presented it in case it was needed. She climbed down without needing it, which he accepted without comment. She stood in the settling dust and looked at the place. The cabin was low and solid, built from rough-hewn timber that had been chinked with a mixture of clay and dry grass in the spaces between the logs. The chinking had cracked in places from the heat and the dryness, and in at least 2 spots along the north wall she could see where the gaps were wide enough to let in a finger of outside air. The porch needed a board replaced on the left side. The door hung correctly in its frame, which told her the foundation was still sound. The cabin had not shifted. The roof was tin, which would be brutal in the heat, but would channel rain efficiently if rain ever came, and which had the advantage of durability over wood shingle that was worth something out here. "It needs work," Jesse said. "Most things worth keeping do," Martha said. She kept looking, taking inventory. The way she had always taken inventory of things, not with judgment, but with the practical eye of someone who intended to improve what she saw and needed to understand it accurately first. Inside the cabin was a single large room with a loft above it, accessible by a ladder nailed to the wall. The main room had a cast-iron stove along the east wall, a plank table with 2 chairs, a shelf of dry goods that was significantly less full than it should have been, and a wooden crate on its side that served as a bedside table, next to a rope bed in the corner with a mattress that had seen better decades. A kerosene lantern hung from a ceiling beam. The floor was packed earth covered in places with rough board planking that had warped slightly from years of heat and cold cycling through the wood. It smelled of dust and machine oil and the particular dry emptiness of a space that had been occupied by a single person for a long time, a space that had function but not the layered smell of a home, not the accumulated presence of daily life fully lived. Martha set her bundle on the table and looked up at the loft. "I'll take the loft," she said. "You keep the bed." Jessie looked at her steadily. "That's backwards. The loft gets the full heat of the stove." "I sleep warm, too," she said, which was not the complete reason, but was true enough. The complete reason was that the loft was separate and elevated, and she needed the physical reality of her own space in this arrangement, a place that was defined as hers, because the contract they had made was a practical one, and she was not willing to blur its lines through the kind of careless proximity that led to misunderstandings about what had been agreed to and what had not. He did not argue. He went out to begin unhitching the horse, and she began unpacking what she had brought, which took very little time, because there was very little to unpack, and then she lit the lantern and looked at the cabin, with the proper light of it, seeing the chinking gaps. Seeing the way the shelf of dry goods was organized, or rather not organized, seeing the accumulation of small domestic disorders that a man living alone and spending most of his waking hours outside produces without noticing a coat hung on a nail at an angle that would eventually tear the collar a bucket with a small crack in it that had been set back in service anyway, 3 mugs and no plates, a skillet with a handle that had been reattached imprecisely and would come loose again inside a week. She spent the first night sitting at the table by the lantern with a small piece of paper she had found in the back of the dry goods shelf, writing an inventory of what the place needed. Not of what she wished it were, but of what it actually required to function safely through the rest of the summer. Chinking compound for the wall gaps, a new bucket, a plate or two, some form of curtain or shutter for the south-facing window which would let in heat like a furnace mouth during the midday hours. A better organized food supply with careful rationing built into the plan. Jessie came in once late, saw her at the table, and said nothing. He hung his hat on the nail with the coat, took off his boots, and went to his corner bed. He was asleep within minutes, the deep immediate sleep of a man who works outdoors until the work is done and then stops completely. Martha finished her list. Then she folded the paper and put it in her pocket and climbed the ladder to the loft where the heat was exactly as Jessie had said it would be, stored in the roof boards above her and radiating downward. She lay on the blanket she had brought from her mother's house and looked at the underside of the tin roof in the dark and made herself breathe evenly until the heat became simply a condition rather than a problem, and then she slept. She was up before him in the morning. This surprised him. She could tell by the slight adjustment in his expression when he came out of sleep and found the stove already lit and a pot of something on it. A thin porridge made from the cornmeal she had found in the back of the shelf, stretched with water and a small amount of the dried beef she had brought. He sat at the table without ceremony and ate what she put in front of him and said it was good, which she took as the operational truth. It was intended to be not a compliment designed to please her, but an accurate assessment of a practical thing. She told him what was on her list. He listened to all of it in the same way he always listened, completely, without interrupting. And when she was done, he said that most of it was right, and that he had a bag of dried clay mix in the barn he had bought 3 months ago, intending to do the chinking, and not found the time for. She said she would do the chinking today if he would show her where the bag was. He showed her, and she spent the morning on the north wall of the cabin with the dried clay mix reconstituted in a small amount of their rationed water, pressing it into the gaps with her fingers, and a flat piece of wood smoothing it, and checking the consistency, and doing it the way she did. Everything which was with thoroughness and without hurry, because haste in repair work creates a surface fix over a structural problem, and the structure is always what matters. The days established their pattern quickly and without much discussion, which suited them both. Jesse was out before full light, moving through the tasks that keeping 43 cattle alive in a drought demanded: hauling water from the tank to the troughs, checking the fence lines for breaks, moving the herd to whatever sparse grazing remained on the eastern portion of the range where the grass was least depleted, returning with them in the heat of the day, going out again in the late afternoon. The work was relentless and largely invisible in its results, the kind of work that success measured by things not getting worse rather than things actively improving the defensive labor of a man holding a line that the drought was constantly trying to push back. Martha worked the cabin and the ground immediately around it with the same relentlessness. She chinked the walls and replaced the bucket and organized the dry goods by type and quantity with the careful eye of someone who had rationed through hard seasons before and understood that the difference between a household that survives a shortage and one that doesn't is almost never the quantity of what you start with, but the discipline with which you manage it. She instituted a water budget that she kept track of in her head: so many gallons for cooking, so much for washing, a precise amount for her garden project. Which was the thing she was most deliberate about, and which Jesse, when he first saw it, looked at with an expression she couldn't immediately read. She had found the location herself, a spot on the south side of the cabin where the morning shadow from the roof's overhang stretched longest, giving the ground beneath it shade until nearly 10 in the morning. She had dug the bed by hand with the spade from the barn, working early when the ground was at its least hostile, turning the dry soil and mixing into it the contents of the composting pile she had found behind the barn, which Jesse had apparently been building without a clear purpose for some time, and which contained enough decomposed organic matter to give thin soil something to hold. She had planted what she had brought a small paper envelope of bean seeds she had been saving. Some dried herb cuttings she had taken as starts from her mother's garden without asking, because they were things she had planted and tended herself, and she considered them at least partly hers, and 3 small tomato seedlings she had started indoors in a can on the windowsill of her mother's house and carried to the ranch wrapped in a damp cloth in her coat pocket. Jesse stood at the edge of the garden bed one morning, looking at it for a long moment. "Ground's too dry," he said. "At the surface," she agreed. "Lower it's better. I tested it." He looked at her. "How?" "Dug down 18 inches with a stick at 4 spots along the bed. The color changes at 14. Darker. It's holding something down there." She paused. "Enough for this if I water carefully." He looked at the seedlings, small and determined, looking in the turned earth, the bean seeds already showing their first tentative split of green at the soil surface. "You're rationing your garden water out of your own share," he said. It was not a question. "It's my garden," she said simply, and went back to her work. The days added up. 2 weeks became 3. The heat did not break. The drought did not break. But the ranch did not collapse either, and in the conditions of that summer, not collapsing was its own kind of triumph the cattle held. The water in the tank went down slowly, but Jesse had made an arrangement with a rancher 12 miles east who had a functioning well, and twice a week he made the long round trip with barrels to bring water back, a grueling half-day each time that left him visibly depleted in a way he would not acknowledge or discuss. Martha noticed. She catalogued it in the place where she kept true things about people. She noticed the way he favored his left side on the days after the long water runs, the faint compression of his expression that meant something was hurting and was being overridden by the discipline of a man who did not allocate time in his day for pain. She noticed that he ate whatever she put in front of him without comment or preference, which was not indifference, but the focused efficiency of a man whose body was a tool he needed to keep operational, and who could not afford to be particular about its fuel. She noticed that he talked to the cattle in a low, continuous voice when he was working them. Not words exactly, just sound, the kind of sound that animals respond to because it carries the frequency of calm. and that this same voice at a lower register sometimes carried through the cabin wall at night, when she lay in the loft telling her he was moving through the barn in the last hour before he slept, making the final check, reassuring the animals, and perhaps also reassuring himself that the things he was responsible for were still there and still all right. She began leaving his supper plate on the stove, covered with a cloth, on the nights when she knew the water run or a fence emergency would keep him out past dark. She did this without mentioning it. He ate whatever was there when he came in, and in the morning the plate was washed and set back on the shelf, and nothing was said about it. This was the language they had developed, and it was not a small language. It was specific, and it was sufficient, and it communicated things that neither of them was constituted to say directly, things about consistency and dependability, and the particular comfort of knowing that another person is managing their share of what needs to be managed without requiring you to think about it. It was mid-July, 3 weeks and 4 days into her time at the ranch, when Jessie came in after dark on a night that was not a water run night. She heard the horse first, the particular uneven sound of it, and she knew before he came through the door that something was wrong. She was at the stove. The lantern lit the cabin warm with the stored heat of the day. He pushed the door open, and she turned, and in the lamplight she saw his right forearm. The gash ran from just below his elbow to the inside of his wrist, long and ragged, the kind of wound that barbed wire makes when it catches a moving arm at speed, and the arm's momentum does the rest of the work. It was deep in the center and had been bleeding for a while. The fabric of his rolled sleeve saturated dark and dried at the edges in the way that meant it had been bleeding slowly for some time rather than freely, which was actually the more dangerous pattern. It had tried to close on its own and failed, and was still seeping. He sat down in the chair she put in front of him without argument, which told her how tired he was, because he was not a man who accepted direction easily, and his willingness to simply sit said more about the state of him than the wound itself. She moved quickly and without any wasted motion. She got the clean cloth she kept for medical use, a length of linen she had washed and set aside in the first week, because she had known that a ranch in a drought worked by an exhausted man was a place where injuries accumulated, and the water, the small reserve she kept for emergencies, and the tin of dried herb that she had been cultivating for its antiseptic properties since arriving. Common yarrow that grew along the south fence line, and that she had dried and powdered with the patience of someone who understands that the preparation you make in the easy moment is what saves you in the hard one. She cleaned the wound in the careful, thorough way that cleaning a wound requires, without hurrying past the parts that must be done properly to avoid a worse outcome later. Jessie sat very still throughout this. He was looking at the far wall with the concentrated distance of a man directing his attention away from sensation, and his jaw was set. But he didn't flinch, and he didn't make a sound. She threaded her heaviest needle with the thread from her leather pouch, the same pouch that had sat on her knee on the post office porch, and had been with her through the social, and the contract, and the wagon ride, and every morning of work since. She drew the thread through the beeswax block twice. She looked at the center of the wound where the gap was widest. "This is going to hold," she said, and it was both a statement about what she was about to do and something else, something she didn't elaborate on and didn't need to. She put in 7 stitches, small, tight, precisely spaced, the same quality of work she brought to fabric. Understanding that a stitch that holds under tension is different from a stitch that merely closes a gap. While she worked, her hands were close to his arm, very close, closer than they had been to any part of him since they had shaken hands at the signing of the marriage certificate, and the proximity of it was something she was aware of with the part of her that noticed things, cataloging it, alongside everything else she had noted and filed. In the past weeks, his voice through the cabin wall, the plate washed and set back the way he had said, she hadn't quit the long water runs he made without complaint. She was securing the last stitch, her fingers working in the tight, focused way that fine needlework demands when he moved. He reached up with his uninjured hand, his left hand, and he caught her wrist. Not hard, not with force, with the particular deliberate gentleness of a strong man, being careful about the difference between his strength and the moment. He held her wrist lightly, stopping the movement of her hands, and she looked up from the wound to his face. In the lantern light, his expression was different from anything she had seen in it before. The stillness was still there, but the quality of it had changed. It was not the stillness of water that has no current. It was the stillness of water that has a very strong current, and is holding it. He said, "You don't have to carry it all by yourself, Martha." He had not used her first name before. The contract had been Miss Crowley until it was Mrs. Carter, and since then it had been nothing the elegant efficiency of a household where two people knew which conversations belonged to the other without having to be told. The first name in his voice, low and even as always, but with something underneath it that had not been there before, landed differently than she expected. She looked at him for a moment. Outside, the night was perfectly still. There was no wind. There hadn't been real wind in weeks. The lantern flame did not move. "I know that," she said, but the words came out quieter than she intended, and she didn't take her wrist away from his hand. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the thing that passed between them in that moment was not a romantic thing in the way that word is usually understood, not tender and decorated and announced. It was something more fundamental than that, the recognition between two people who have been each in their own way profoundly alone for a long time of something in the other person that answers a question they have stopped expecting to have answered. Not the question of whether someone will be good to them, though that was in it, but the deeper question of whether someone will simply see them, see the actual dimensions of what they are and what they are capable of, and not look away. She put the last stitch in and tied it off with 3 small clean knots. She wrapped the wound in the clean linen firmly enough to support the stitches, loosely enough to allow circulation. She checked her work, once running her thumb along the outside of the wrapping, reading the even pressure, the way she read seams, making sure there was no point of excess tension. Then she sat back and took a long breath. "You need to keep that dry for 48 hours, she said. "I've got fence work tomorrow," he said. "You've got fence work in 48 hours, she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that might on a different man's face have been the beginning of an argument, and then he looked at the wrapped arm, and then back at her, and he said, "All right." This was remarkable. She filed it with everything else. She began putting away the medical supplies, wrapping the remaining clean linen, setting the herbs back in their tin. He sat in the chair and watched her move around the cabin in the lamplight with the expression of a man who is looking at something he has not fully looked at before, or has looked at in a particular way and is now looking at in a different one. "The garden's doing something," he said. She paused. It was an odd moment to say it. She understood that it was not entirely about the garden. "It is," she said. "I didn't think it would," he said. "I know," she said. "That's all right. It is anyway." He almost smiled. She saw the edges of it, the slight change at the corners of his mouth, the small release of something he usually kept more contained. It was there, and then it was gone, but she had seen it, and she catalogued it with the same careful attention she gave everything that was true, and she thought that it was a good thing to have seen. She took the lantern to the base of the ladder and looked up at the loft. "Sleep," she said. It was not motherly. It was the direct instruction of a working partner who understood the resource value of a rested person over a depleted one and was managing for the long term. He moved toward the corner bed. She climbed the ladder to the loft, the lantern in her hand, and when she reached the top, she set it on the flat piece of board she used as a shelf and looked out the small gap under the eave that served as the loft's only ventilation. The sky was enormous and full of stars and entirely without cloud. The land below it was black and still and dry as ash. Somewhere in the dark 6 miles to the north, the town of Red Dust Crossing sat in its hollow, and people were deciding whether to stay or to go, whether the land was worth it, whether they were strong enough for what it was asking. Martha looked at the stars for a long while. She thought about water underground. She thought about roots that go deep enough to find what the surface has lost. She thought about 7 stitches holding closed a wound that the wire had made. And she thought about how the difference between a wound that heals and one that doesn't is almost always the quality of attention brought to it in the first hours. She thought about a man who had said her name in a room lit by a single flame, and told her she didn't have to carry all of it alone, and about the way she had not moved her wrist, and about what that small stillness had meant, which she was not prepared to name yet, but which she was also no longer willing to pretend was nothing. Below her, Jessie Carter's breathing slowed into sleep. Outside, the windmill stood motionless against the stars. And in the small, turned earth bed on the south side of the cabin, in the dark, the bean seedlings and the tomato plants held on with the particular tenacity of living things that have been given just enough and have decided in the wordless way that growing things decide that it will be sufficient, that the soil beneath them has something to offer, that it is worth the effort of sending roots down into the difficult ground to find it. Martha lay back on her blanket in the hot loft and closed her eyes. She was not afraid of what was changing. She had never been the kind of person who was afraid of change when the change was real and honestly arrived at. She was the kind of person who read a thing carefully, who made sure she understood the seams and the stress points and the places where the fabric was sound and the places where it required attention, and then she committed to the work of it with everything she had. Whatever was growing here in this cabin and on this land and between 2 people who had made a practical agreement and were discovering quietly, without announcement, that practicality is sometimes the most honest form that tenderness takes, she would tend it the way she tended everything. She would tend it with patience and with honesty, and with the calloused, capable, entirely reliable hands of a woman who had learned across the whole hard length of her life that the things worth having are the things worth working for. The stars turned slowly above the tin roof. The land waited for rain. And in the morning there would be work to do. The 48 hours passed. The fence work resumed. The wound healed cleanly the way wounds do when they have been properly attended to, closing from the inside out, leaving a seam of new skin that was pink and tight, and would eventually become a scar that Jessie Carter would carry for the rest of his life, without thinking much about it, the way people carry most of the marks that matter. What did not return to its previous state was the particular quality of distance that had existed between them before that night. It had not been a hostile distance. It had been the distance of 2 people honoring the terms of a careful agreement, keeping themselves on their respective sides of a line they had both understood and respected. But something had shifted in the lamplight over 7 stitches, and a wrist held gently, and a name said for the first time in a particular way, and neither of them pretended otherwise, though neither of them named it either, because naming it would have required a conversation that neither of them was ready to have, and that the work of the ranch in its relentless and democratic demand on their time and energy did not provide much space for anyway. What changed was smaller than a conversation, and larger than either of them acknowledged. It was the way Jessie began leaving the lantern lit when he knew she was still in the loft reading before sleep. The way Martha started setting 2 cups of morning coffee, instead of leaving the pot on the stove for him to serve himself, not as a gesture of service, but as a gesture of presence. The quiet domestic signal that she was aware he was there, and that his morning was something she had factored into hers. It was the way he began to brief her each evening on the state of the herd and the range and the water supply. Not as a report to a partner in the legal sense, but as the natural sharing of a person who has started to think of another person as someone whose understanding of their situation matters to the outcome of it. It was the way she began to consult him about the garden, not because she needed his advice, but because she had noticed that he liked being asked, that something in him responded to being included in the smaller world of the cabin and the garden, the way a plant responds to being turned toward light. August arrived without mercy. The heat intensified in the particular way that late summer heat intensifies in dry country, not just higher in temperature, but denser in quality, as though the air itself had been baking for so long that it had changed its composition and was now something you moved through rather than breathed. The ground had cracked in a pattern that Martha had heard old-timers describe, but had never seen herself: deep fissures in the earth's surface, running in irregular lines across the yard, and the range, some of them 2 inches wide, and dropping into a dark that you could not see the bottom of if you crouched and looked. The cattle were gaunt. There was no other word for it. Jesse moved them twice a day, now chasing the last of the grazing across a range that was giving up its final reserves, and the animals went where he directed them with the docile exhaustion of creatures that have been pushed past complaint into simple endurance. He had sold 11 head in July, a transaction that had cost him something beyond the money it represented, and the money it represented had been less than half what the animals were worth in a fair market. Because the market was not fair, because everyone with cattle was trying to sell and almost no one was buying. He had used the money to extend the water contract with the eastern rancher for another month. Martha tracked all of it in her head the way she tracked everything. The numbers were not good. They had not been good for some time. But they were not yet unworkable, which was the only standard she was holding them to, because unworkable was the only threshold that actually required a change of plan, and they had not reached it. She had also been tracking something else: the sky. She had been watching the sky the way she watched everything, with patient, systematic attention, not with hope, but with information-gathering discipline, looking for what was actually there rather than what she wanted to be there. And in the first week of August, she had begun to notice something in the western horizon on certain evenings, a quality of cloud formation that was different from the decorative high-altitude wisps that had been taunting the region all summer. These were lower. They had a different density, a different color at their base, a particular gray-blue heaviness that suggested they were carrying something. She did not say anything about this to Jesse for 3 days because she did not want to offer him something that might come to nothing, and because she was still verifying what she was seeing against other signs she had learned from years of observing weather on high plains country. The way the cattle moved in the late afternoon, the behavior of the few remaining birds, the quality of the air pressure against her skin, a change so subtle it was barely measurable but real. On the 4th day, she said, "Storm coming." Jesse looked at the sky from the barn doorway where he was working. He looked for a long time without speaking. "Could be," he said. "Not today," she said. "Not tomorrow. 3 days, maybe 4. He looked at her. "You sure?" "No," she said honestly, "but I think so." He went back to what he was doing, and she went back to what she was doing, and they did not discuss it further because there was nothing further to discuss. Either the storm came or it did not. What you could control, you controlled. What you couldn't, you prepared for, and then you managed as it arrived. The preparation was significant. A storm after a drought of this magnitude and duration was not a simple thing. The ground cracked and compacted, and stripped of the root systems that normally absorbed rainfall, gradually would not drink the water the way healthy ground drinks it. It would run. Fast and in volume, it would run across the hard pan surface and collect in the low places and carry with it every loose particle of dust and topsoil that the drought had loosened, and it would do this with a force proportional to how long the water had been absent, which in this case was a very long time. Martha spent 2 days preparing the cabin. She moved everything off the floor that could be moved, not because she expected flooding inside, but because the ground around the cabin's base had cracked in places that could allow water to undercut the foundation if it ran hard enough and long enough. She banked the base of the cabin walls with the clay and dirt she had left over from the chinking project, creating a low berm that would deflect the first surge of surface water away from the foundation. She secured the shutters on the south window with an additional brace. She moved her garden's most vulnerable plants into the deep shade of the overhang and rigged a makeshift barrier from spare lumber and the heavy canvas tarp she had found folded in the back of the barn, creating a buffer that would break the force of direct rainfall on the seedlings without cutting off their access to water entirely. Because they needed the rain as badly as everything else, they just needed it not to hit them with the force of a storm that had been storing itself up for months. Jessie worked the range and the barn and the fence lines, doing the preparation that keeping animals safe in severe weather required, checking every board, every wire, every gate latch, moving the herd to the section of the range that offered the most natural windbreak from the long low ridge to the southeast. On the third evening after she had said storm coming, they ate supper together at the plank table, and the air outside had changed so completely that the change was palpable even inside the cabin, a pressure, a weight, a held breath quality to the atmosphere that made sounds carry differently and made the lantern flame lean in ways that had no visible cause. "Tomorrow," Martha said. Jessie looked up from his plate. "Tomorrow," she said again more quietly. He nodded once. They finished eating in the particular silence of two people who are each running their own internal inventory of what they have done and what they have left undone, and what they will do in the morning with whatever time they have before the thing arrives. "The cattle are as settled as I can get them," he said finally. "The cabin is as ready as I can make it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she had not expected. "You've done a good job here, Martha." He said it looking at his hands the way he sometimes said the things that cost him something to say, as though the words required a specific angle to come out properly. Not just the cabin, all of it, the rationing and the garden and the chinking and the way you've managed the numbers. He paused. "I want you to know I see it." She held this in the way she held the things he said that were important carefully with full attention. "I know you do," she said. And this was true, and it was a different kind of truth than it might have been 2 months ago, because she had learned the specific vocabulary of how he showed attention, which was nothing like the vocabulary of men who performed their regard loudly, and which was all the more legible to her for being quiet. The storm came the next afternoon. It did not arrive gradually. It arrived the way the worst storms on high plains country always arrive, with the terrifying efficiency of something that has been building its power over hundreds of miles of flat open land and meets no significant obstacle until it meets you. Martha was at the south side of the cabin checking the berm she had built when she heard it, a sound like nothing else in her experience, a low sustained roar from the northwest that was not thunder and was not wind, as she had known wind, but was both of those things and something additional, something that was the sound of weather at a scale that makes a person understand in their body, rather than their mind, exactly how large the world is and exactly how small they are within it. She looked up. The sky to the northwest had turned. What had been a heavy gray cloud mass was now a vertical wall of brown and black that extended from the cloud base to the ground and was moving with a speed that was not consistent with her previous understanding of how weather moved. The bottom of it was not clean. It churned the dust it was carrying, giving it a boiling quality, the mass constantly reshaping itself as it consumed more surface material and integrated it into what it was already carrying. The light had gone from the afternoon sun the way light goes when someone passes a hand over a flame suddenly and completely. She had perhaps 90 seconds. She ran, not toward the cabin. The cabin was 60 feet to her left, but Jessie was at the barn. She had seen him there 20 minutes ago, and the barn was in the direction the storm was coming from, not between her and it, but closer to it. And he would need the additional time she had over him. She covered the ground between herself and the barn in the long, ground-eating stride of a woman built for work, her arms pumping the noise of the approaching storm, growing from a roar into something that occupied the entire auditory landscape. That was not a sound you heard with your ears, but a vibration you felt in your chest and your teeth and the soles of your feet. She hit the barn door with both palms and pushed it open. Jesse was at the far end of the barn moving toward her. He had heard it too, and they met in the middle of the barn floor in the dimming light with the sound of the storm's leading edge beginning to catch the roof and the walls, a first scattering of high-velocity grit against the tin that was like the sound of a handful of sand thrown against a drum, and then a second heavier wave, and then the barn door she had come through blew shut with a force that shook the frame. "We stay here," Jesse said. It was not a question. "We stay," she confirmed. The barn went dark, not the slow dark of evening, but an immediate total dark, as though something had placed its hand over the sun. Jesse found the lantern in the dark by memory, which told her he had considered this possibility and had positioned it where he could reach it without light, and he lit it with hands that were completely steady, which told her something she was not surprised to know about him, which was that he did not rattle. The lantern threw a small circle of orange light in the black interior. Around them, the barn's timber frame was speaking in a language of stress and adjustment, the deep groan of structural wood under lateral load, the high complaint of the roof tin being worked by wind pressure. The cattle in the stalls were moving the low, distressed movement of large animals in an enclosed space, who know something is wrong and do not know what to do with the knowing. Jesse moved along the stalls with his free hand, touching each animal briefly, the same low, continuous sound he made when he worked them, and the animal steadied slightly, not fully, but enough. Martha took the lantern from him, so his hands were free for the animals holding it at chest height, moving it where he needed it as he moved from stall to stall, the two of them working in the coordinate, efficient way they had developed without discussing it each, knowing without instruction what the other needed done and doing it. The storm hit its full force. She had thought she understood in the minutes before it arrived what it would be. She had been wrong. The sound was the first thing that surpassed her expectation, a sound so total and so encompassing that it ceased to be a sound in the ordinary sense and became instead a condition of existence, a thing you were inside of rather than a thing you were hearing. The barn walls flexed. She could feel it in her feet, the slight give of the board flooring as the lateral pressure shifted the structure a quarter inch one direction and back, the building breathing under the load. The lantern flame streamed horizontal in the draft coming through the cracks, and she shielded it with her body curling around it, keeping it lit, because the light was the functional thing, the thing that allowed them to see what they were dealing with and to manage what could be managed. The roof lifted, not off, not entirely. But she felt the moment when the wind pressure got underneath the east edge of the tin and the boards to which it was nailed shrieked upward by some fraction and then were pulled back by the nails and the weight of the material. And this happened 3 times in succession, each time the release louder than the time before. And on the 3rd time, a section of tin along the east side peeled back, with a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of paper, and the interior of the barn was suddenly open to the sky in a strip 3 feet wide and 10 feet long, and through this opening came not rain, because there was still no rain, but wind and dust and darkness in a quantity and force that was beyond anything she had experienced standing upright in the open air. Jesse was beside her before she had finished understanding what had happened. He did not hesitate, and he did not speak. He simply put himself between her and the open section of roof, between her and the streaming black air that was coming through it. And he kept moving, steering both of them with the purposeful, unhurried efficiency of a man who has decided what he is doing and is doing it toward the back corner of the barn where the structure was oldest and most braced and where the root of the original framing gave the walls their deepest anchor. The corner was low. They were both down, not on the ground entirely, but crouched Martha's back against the corner post, and Jesse angled in front of her, his shoulders forward, his broad back, creating a physical barrier between her and the direction of the worst of the streaming air. She had the lantern inside the shelter his body made, and it held its flame there, steady in the broken shelter of him, and the circle of light it cast was small and immediate and real. She could feel the vibration of the storm through the post at her back, and through the ground beneath her feet, and through the warmth of him, close in the dark, closer than they had been since the night of the stitches, and she was not afraid, which surprised her, because the storm was not a small thing, and the barn was not unambiguously safe, and the rational calculation of the situation included possibilities she did not want to consider. She was not afraid because Jesse Carter was afraid she could feel it in him, the particular controlled quality of a man managing real fear rather than performing the absence of it. And the fact that he was afraid, and was here anyway between her and the open roof managing it, doing what needed to be done, was the most stabilizing thing she had encountered in the entire length of the storm. He turned his head, and his face was very close to hers in the small lantern light. "You all right," he said, and his voice was low and even, but had the quality of something beneath it that was not entirely even. "Yes," she said. "You." He didn't answer that directly. He looked at her for a moment in the orange light, with the storm taking the world apart around them, and in his expression was the thing she had been cataloging in pieces for 2 months, the recognition, the looking and not looking away, the particular quality of attention that was not assessment and was not strategy, but was something simpler and more fundamental and more permanent than either of those things. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. His jaw moved slightly. The roof groaned above them. A new gust hit the barn's west wall, and the structure answered it, with a sound like something giving way, which resolved itself into the sound of boards under extreme load that had not yet broken, which was not the same as breaking though in the dark, and the noise they felt similar. "When I came to you on that porch," he said, "about the bank, I told you I'd been watching you." "You did," she said. "I didn't tell you all of what I'd seen." He paused. The wind filled the pause with noise. "I saw a woman sit down in the middle of the worst moment of her public life and pick up her work. Not to prove a point, not to perform anything for anyone, because work was what she had, and work was what she knew, and she wasn't going to let what the town did to her steal that from her." He stopped again. His voice had lost none of its evenness, but it had gained something else, a density, a weight that she could feel alongside the weight of the storm. "I told myself I was coming back to the porch because I needed something practical, and I did, but that was not all of what I needed." The lantern flame leaned in a new draft and steadied. "Jesse," she said. "I'm not losing this ranch," he said, and the shift in direction was so abrupt it took her a half-second to follow it, and then she understood that he was not changing the subject, that it was the same subject, that the ranch and what he was saying were the same sentence. "I'm not losing this land, but what I couldn't tell the bank, what I couldn't tell anyone, was that the reason I stopped being willing to lose it is not the cattle or the water or the land itself." He looked at her in the lantern light. "It's what's in that cabin. It's what's growing in that garden bed. It's the inventory list you wrote on your third night here and left on the table because you thought I was asleep. It's the way the cabin smells different now than it did before you came. It's you, Martha. I am afraid of losing you out of this place, and I have been afraid of it for longer than I've let myself think about." The storm was at its full pitch around them, the barn bending and complaining, the dark and the dust and the howling pressure of the worst of the black roller still working its way across the land, and they were in the corner of it together, and the lantern was burning between them. Martha looked at Jesse Carter, at the man who had said what he meant without decoration his entire life, and was saying it now under the hardest conditions he could have chosen. Which she understood was not a coincidence, which she understood was the storm doing what extreme conditions always do, burning away everything that is unnecessary and leaving only what is actually true. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face. Her palm was calloused and her fingers were strong, and she held his face the way she held things she was serious about, with the full capable warmth of hands that knew the difference between holding and gripping and had chosen in this moment to simply hold. He closed his eyes for 1 second, just one. The way a person closes their eyes when something they have been waiting for, without admitting they were waiting, finally arrives. Then he turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist, where the pulse was warm and steady and entirely real. And when he straightened and looked at her again, his expression had changed into something that was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on any person's face, stripped of the stillness and the management, and the careful armor of a man who had learned early that emotion is something you process internally or not at all. She leaned forward, and he met her, and what happened in the small orange light in the corner of the bending, straining barn, while the black roller tore at the world outside them, was not gentle, because neither of them was constituted for gentle. In that sense, it was instead urgent and honest and thorough, the kind of kiss that doesn't ask permission, because permission was granted some time ago in a language that had nothing to do with words, and it was also in its way the most natural conclusion to a conversation that had begun on a porch in the red dust with a needle and thread and a silence that was never really empty. The storm peaked and then began slowly to move on. The great roaring diminished by degrees, the way a train diminishes after it has passed the fundamental noise, reducing into something that was merely very loud, and then merely loud, and then simply the sound of a strong wind, which is an ordinary thing that land knows how to deal with. The barn stopped flexing. The animals in the stalls settled into the low sounds of tired, stressed creatures discovering that the worst has passed. The lantern flame straightened. They sat in the corner with their backs against the post and their shoulders touching, and the lantern between them and outside the storm pushed its way southeast, and the dark it had brought began to lift in the slow watercolor way that natural darkness lifts, revealing the world in increments. "The cabin," Martha said eventually. "Should be standing," Jessie said. "The walls are solid. The berm should have held the base." "Yes." She looked at him in the returning gray light. He was looking at her too. The unguarded thing was still in his face. She thought it might stay there now, or a version of it, something that had been opened and would not close entirely again. "We should look at the roof damage," she said. "We should," he agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. Then she stood and he stood, and they pushed open the barn door together and walked out into what the storm had left behind. The world was altered. There was no other word for what a black roller does to a landscape. The familiar lines of the ranch had been redrawn by the deposit of fine red dust over everything, the fence posts thickened with it, the water tank wearing a new coat of it, the cottonwood trees coated on their windward side, so that they appeared to be made of the same material as the land around them. The east section of the barn roof was peeled back in the long strip she had seen from inside, the raw wood of the decking visible and pale against the red-coated tin. The wind had pushed a section of the garden's canvas barrier partly down, but the berm around the cabin base was intact, and the cabin door was still on its hinges. And when she pushed it open, the floor inside was dusty but dry, and the table was where she had left it, and the leather pouch was where she had left it, and the stove was where she had left it. Jessie came up behind her and stood in the doorway and looked at the interior over her shoulder. "Still standing," he said. "Still standing," she agreed. She turned to look at him in the doorway. His face was red-dusted, his hat coated with it, the dark fabric of his jacket wearing the color of the storm. She supposed she looked the same. She felt it, the fine grit of the storm, everywhere in her hair and on her skin and in the corners of her eyes. He reached out and brushed a streak of dust from her cheekbone with his thumb, a gesture so easy and matter-of-fact and so entirely certain of its own right to exist that it told her more about where they had arrived than anything that had been said in the barn. Then he looked past her at the damaged roof line of the barn calculating the work, and she turned and looked, with him calculating alongside him, because that was what they did, and what they would do, and the storm was behind them now, and the work was in front of them, and they were still standing, which for the moment was everything. The morning after the storm broke, with a stillness that felt almost sacred, the kind of quiet that follows great violence in nature, not an empty quiet, but a full one, weighted with the particular solemnity of things that have been tested and have held. The air was different. Not cooler exactly, not yet, but different in its texture, as though the storm had wrung something out of the atmosphere that had been sitting in it too long, and what remained was cleaner, less burdened, closer to what air is supposed to feel like before seasons of drought teach you to expect less of it. Jesse was up before light, the way he always was, moving through the barn damage assessment with a lantern, while Martha made coffee and took her own account of the cabin's condition in the early gray. The berm had held along all four sides. The floor was dusty but dry. The south-facing window shutter had lost one of its additional braces, but the shutter itself was intact. She swept the interior with methodical efficiency, working from the back corners forward, and when she stepped out onto the porch with her second cup of coffee, the sun was just beginning its climb, and Jesse was standing at the edge of the property's south boundary, looking at the ground with an expression she had learned to read as the particular focused attention he gave to things that were surprising him. She walked to where he was standing. The storm had done what storms in dry country sometimes do when the conditions of drought and cracked earth are exactly right. Along the south boundary, where the land met the beginning of the lower ridge, the velocity and volume of the surface water running off the hard pan during the storm's brief but intense precipitation had moved the thin layer of displaced earth with a force sufficient to cause a slippage in the ridge. Face itself, a landslide of modest but significant proportion, 30 feet across and perhaps 8 feet of vertical drop that had peeled back the surface of the ridge like the cover of a book and exposed the raw face of what was underneath. Jesse was looking at the exposed rock face. Martha looked at it too. The rock was dark in a band running horizontally through the lighter surrounding material, dark in the specific way that rock is dark when it is in regular contact with moisture, a deep charcoal gray that stood in absolute contrast to the red bleached stone on either side of it. Below this band, at the base of the slide, where the loosened earth had come to rest, the soil was wet. Not damp, wet. In a drought that had not produced meaningful rain in months, the soil at the base of that slide was wet with water that was coming from inside the ridge, from the aquifer that Jesse had believed was there for 7 years and had not been able to prove that Martha had read in the lean of the cottonwood roots and the color change at 14 inches when she tested her garden soil and had kept her own counsel about not wanting to offer him a hope that might prove wrong. It was not wrong. Jesse crouched and pressed his palm flat against the wet soil at the base of the slide. He stayed that way for a long moment, his hand in the earth feeling what was coming up through it. Then he looked up at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, and would remember for the rest of her life. It was not the dramatic expression of a man who has received everything he wanted. It was quieter and more complete than that. It was the expression of a man who has been holding something together through sheer force of will for so long that the knowledge that he might be allowed to put it down produces not elation, but something closer to the release of a breath held underwater. A release that is also in its way a kind of grief for the length of time it was held. "It's there," he said. "It's there," she said. He stood. He looked at the rock face, calculating, doing the mental engineering of a man who knows his land and is understanding what this changes about it. "The aquifer. was deep, but the exposed face had breached it. With proper work, with the right approach, a well could be sunk into this location that would access water in a quantity sufficient not just for the ranch, but for a significant amount more. He turned and looked at her, and the morning light was on both of them, and his face was still wearing the expression she had no name for, the one that was release and relief and something else, something that had been building in him since a woman sat down on a porch in the red dust and refused to move. "Martha," he said. "I know," she said. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and put his arms around her in the straightforward way of a man who has decided something and is doing it without ceremony or apology. And she let herself be held, which was not a thing she had much experience with allowing, and found that it was what she had believed it to be from the moment in the barn when she had understood it was coming, which was exactly sufficient, exactly the right size and weight and temperature for what it needed to be. They stood at the edge of their land, with the wet soil at the base of the exposed ridge, and the morning coming in over everything, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because there was nothing that needed saying that they had not already said in the barn in the dark, and what was left was simply the standing together in the fact of what they had found, and what they had built, and what they now needed to do with it. The doing with it started immediately, because they were both people who moved from knowing to doing without much delay. Jessie spent the morning at the exposed face, digging test holes at intervals along the base of the slide to map the extent of the aquifer's surface breach and determine the optimal location for a proper well. Martha spent the morning at the ranch's water situation, calculating what they had in the tank, what the herd needed per day to maintain current condition, and how long the existing supply would last against the projected timeline for sinking a well and making it operational. The numbers were tight, but they worked. They worked in the same way the garden had worked, not with abundance, but with exactly enough, which was all she had ever asked of a set of numbers. By midday, Jessie had identified the well location and had begun the initial excavation with the equipment he had, which was sufficient for the early work, though he would need to make arrangements for the deeper drilling. This was not a small thing. Drilling equipment and the men who operated it cost money, and their money situation was what it had been since the beginning of their arrangement, carefully managed and without surplus. But the situation had changed in a fundamental way, because the presence of an aquifer of this apparent depth and volume on their property changed the property's financial standing in a manner that even Aldous' arithmetic could not argue with. It was Martha who said it first that evening at the plank table over supper. "We go to the bank tomorrow," she said. Jessie looked at her. "The aquifer changes the collateral value of this land significantly," she said. "More than significantly. Water rights on a producing aquifer in a drought region are worth more than the cattle and the land title combined. Aldous knows this. He will have heard about the storm, and he will be doing his own calculations about what it might have changed for various properties." She looked at Jessie steadily. "We go before he has time to find a way to reframe what it means. We go tomorrow, and we present the situation on our terms." Jessie was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved in the way it moved when something she said matched the conclusion he had already reached, and the match satisfied him. "First light," he said. "First light," she agreed. They were in Red Dust Crossing by 8 in the morning, which in the aftermath of the Black Roller was a town that looked as though it had been taken apart and partially reassembled by someone working from memory. The storm had hit the town harder than it had hit the ranch, partly because the town's structures were older and more varied in their integrity, and partly because the ranch's position against the lower ridge had provided a degree of deflection that the open-sitting town did not have. Several storefronts on Main Street had lost sections of their facades. The grain elevator, which had been leaning to the left for as long as anyone could remember, had apparently decided during the storm that this was a reasonable direction to continue in and had come to rest at an angle that made its operational future doubtful. There was debris in the street boards and tin and the miscellaneous inventory of a town that had been shaken and had spilled. There were also people in the street who were in the specific stunned condition of disaster's aftermath, not injured mostly but depleted and disoriented, standing in front of damaged buildings with the look of men and women trying to calculate what came next and finding the arithmetic difficult. Martha saw all of this as they drove the wagon down Main Street. She cataloged it in her careful internal way. She would come back to it. There were things to address here that went beyond their business at the bank, and she knew it, and she set it aside in the designated compartment until the bank was done. Aldous was behind his desk when they entered. He had the slightly rattled quality of a man whose composure has been tested by events outside his control, which was the one category of events that genuinely unsettled him, because Aldous' entire architecture of self was built on the belief that sufficient attention to numbers and terms and conditions could insulate a man from the unpredictable, and the storm had just demonstrated otherwise in terms he could not argue with. He looked at them as they came in, Jesse and Martha together, the same unit they had presented on the day of the marriage certificate, and Martha watched the calculation move through his pale eyes as he assessed them and found them, she could see, less diminished than he had perhaps expected. Jesse laid out the situation plainly, the way he laid out all situations without decoration or strategy, just the facts in their correct order. The landslide along the south boundary, the exposed aquifer face, the test holes, the depth and apparent volume of the water table they had breached. He had brought a hand-drawn map of the property with the aquifer location marked, which Martha had drawn that morning before they left her drafting precise and clear in the way that people who keep accurate internal accounts tend to draw external ones. Aldous looked at the map for a long time. Martha watched him. She had always found it informative to watch a man recalculate when the figures he was working from changed, because the recalculation revealed what he had actually been optimizing for beneath the stated terms of whatever position he had been holding. What she saw in Aldous' face as he looked at the map was not the anger of a man whose plan had been defeated. It was the rapid, unsentimental pivot of a man who understands that the numbers have changed and that his interests now align differently than they did before. He looked up at Jesse. "You'll need drilling equipment," he said. "We will," Jesse said. "I know a company in the county seat." He said it in the tone of a man making an offer which told Martha everything she needed to know about how thoroughly the calculation had shifted, because 2 months ago Aldous would sooner have watched Jesse Carter's ranch dry up and blow away than offer him a contact number for anything. "We appreciate that," Martha said, and her voice was pleasant and entirely level. "We'll also need the loan terms extended by 60 days to allow for the well development, after which the revised property valuation should allow us to discuss a renegotiated payment structure that reflects the actual asset base." Aldous looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had been dealing with Jesse Carter as a particular type of problem and was now understanding that the variable he had underestimated was not Jesse. "That seems reasonable," he said. Martha held his gaze for a moment with the same steady, uncomplicated directness she had used on everyone who had underestimated her, which was not combative and was not triumphant. It was simply present, the gaze of a woman who knew what she had and knew what it was worth and was no longer available to accept anyone else's lower valuation of either. "Good," she said. "Then we're in agreement." They were. The papers were adjusted and signed before 10 in the morning. They walked out of the limestone building for the second time together, and this time, when they stood on the step in the morning light, the quality of what they had behind them and what they had ahead of them was different in a way that Martha felt in her chest. Not as triumph, because triumph implies a contest, and she had never wanted a contest, but as a settling the sensation of something that has been under undue pressure being allowed to return to its proper form. Jesse took her hand on the step. He did it without looking at her, and without preamble simply reached over and took her hand. The way you take hold of something that belongs within reach of you, and she let her fingers close around his. Then she looked at the street. The street was where the work was. She had known since they drove down it that morning that the storm's aftermath in Red Dust Crossing was something they could address, that the water they now had access to was not simply theirs, not in the way that mattered, not in the way that a woman who has been denied and diminished by a community chooses to engage with that community when the positions reverse. Not for revenge, not for vindication, but because the water was there, and the people were thirsty, and those two facts existed in a relationship that required a response. She said this to Jesse, standing on the step of the bank with his hand in hers. She laid it out in the practical way. She laid out all plans, what they had, what the town needed, what the fair and reasonable mechanism for distribution would look like, how it could work without creating dependency or resentment or the particular complicated debt that comes from charity given without respect. He listened to all of it, and when she was done, he said, "We load the barrels this afternoon." "We load them this afternoon," she said. They drove home, filled every barrel and container the ranch possessed from the water that was still flowing at the base of the exposed ridge face, a good flow, a strong, steady seep that would become a proper spring once the well was properly sunk, and would be something genuinely significant once the drilling was done. They filled the barrels until the wagon rode heavy with the weight of it, and the horse leaned into the harness with the dignified effort of an animal doing a real job, and they drove back into Red Dust Crossing in the afternoon with the water sloshing in the barrels behind them. They set up at the end of Main Street, next to the post office with its familiar porch, and Martha felt the specific resonance of this location, the same boards, the same warped gray planking, the place where she had sat down with her needle and refused to run. Jesse set up the distribution with the practical efficiency of a man who knows how to manage resources under pressure portions, clear and consistent. No favoritism, no theater. Just water made available to people who needed it, and a system for distributing it that any reasonable person could see was fair. The town came. Of course the town came. They had been desperate for weeks, and the storm had taken more from some of them, and the summer had been taking from all of them for months. And here was water in a quantity that was not lavish, but was real, and the woman and the man distributing it were doing it without performance or price. Martha stood at the wagon and helped fill the containers that people brought. She looked at the faces of the people who had been in the square that day, the ones who had laughed and the ones who had looked at their shoes, and she felt no particular feeling about them that required expression. They were thirsty people getting water. That was the transaction, and it was sufficient. She was handing a filled bucket to an older man whose house she knew had lost part of its roof in the storm when she became aware of a figure at the edge of the gathering. Standing slightly apart from the main group, the way a person stands when they are part of a situation but are not sure of their status within it. Wearing the same narrow-shouldered posture that Martha had navigated around her entire life, the chin lifted in the angle that meant performance of dignity. The eyes moving between Martha and the wagon and the crowd with a calculation that Martha recognized as her mother's particular way of assessing which direction advantage lay. Vera Crowley had not changed in the month since Martha had walked out of her house with the box of her father's things in her pocket. The drought had taken something from her, as it had taken something from everyone. She was thinner, and her face had the drawn quality of a summer. Without enough of anything, but the fundamental architecture of her was intact, the watchfulness, the positioning, the constant low-level management of how she was perceived. She was wearing her better dress, which told Martha she had planned this appearance, had chosen her presentation for whatever she had decided this moment was. Martha handed out 2 more buckets before Vera reached her. She did not stop working while Vera approached. She filled the next container and handed it to the family that needed it, and looked at her mother with the clear, unobstructed regard of a woman who has had many months to decide exactly who she is in relation to this person, and has arrived at a position that is settled and complete. Vera stopped in front of her. She had the expression she always wore when she wanted something and was managing the approach to asking for it. Not quite asking yet, establishing the ground. First, the shared history, the claim of connection. "Martha," she said, "I heard about the water, about the spring." She paused, and in the pause was the framework of everything she was about to build. "I thought perhaps, given that you have so much now, and given that I am your mother, and that blood is blood, and what's past is past, that you might consider making some provision for me, a place perhaps, some arrangement." Her eyes moved to Jessie standing at the back of the wagon and came back to Martha. "It would only be fair." Martha looked at her mother for a long moment. She thought about the square. She thought about not worth a cow said at full volume, for a crowd's consumption, said with the particular cruelty that is not even fully intentional, that comes from a person so captured by their own desperation that they sacrifice everything within reach of them without registering what they are burning. She thought about the blue dress and the leather pouch and the porch and the chair and the needle going into the fabric steady and certain while the crowd found something else to look at. She reached into the barrel beside her and filled a bucket to the brim. She held it out to her mother. "This is water for a thirsty woman," Martha said, and her voice was even and quiet, and carried no heat and no performance and no residue of any of the things that had happened between them, because all of those things had been processed and set down and were finished. "You are welcome to it, and to refill it as many times as you need today." Vera took the bucket. Her eyes had shifted into the particular look of a person recalibrating rapidly, understanding that the approach she had planned was not landing where she had aimed it. Martha looked at her with the full, clear, undeflected regard that she had been developing since she was a child, sitting in rooms where she was not wanted, and deciding each time to take up her proper amount of space anyway. "But my home has no room for someone who priced her daughter cheaper than a cow," she said. "That is not anger talking. That is simply the truth of where things stand between us. I wish you no harm. I am giving you water, the same as I am giving everyone water. But the door to my house is not open to you, and I want you to understand that this is a decision I have made clearly and with my whole mind, not in bitterness, not in haste." She paused. "That is the most honest thing I can offer you. I believe it is more than you ever offered me." Vera Crowley stood with the bucket of water in both hands and looked at her daughter with an expression that moved through several things in quick succession: indignation, calculation, and finally something that Martha had not seen in her mother's face before, something smaller and more honest than any of the performances, a flicker of recognition. The brief and undefended acknowledgement of a woman who knows in the part of herself that is still capable of knowing that she has been seen accurately. She did not speak. She turned and carried her bucket back through the crowd. Martha watched her go. She felt Jessie's presence at her shoulder, not touching her, simply there, the specific warmth of his proximity that she had learned to read as fluently as she read fabric or weather or the faces of people navigating difficult truths. He had heard all of it. He said nothing because nothing needed to be said, and this was one of the things she valued most about him, the understanding of when silence was the right language. She turned back to the barrel and the next person waiting, and she filled the next container with steady hands, and the afternoon moved forward. The distribution went on for 2 hours. When the barrels were empty, they were genuinely empty, not conserved, not rationed against future use, given out fully and without remainder, because Martha had calculated exactly what they could spare and had decided to spare all of it, and the calculation was right in the way that her calculations generally were. When the last bucket was filled, Jessie lifted the empty barrels back into the wagon bed with the easy economy of a strong man doing familiar work, and Martha folded the cloth she had used to wipe the barrel rims and put it in her pocket. The crowd had thinned. The afternoon was long and late. the shadows beginning their extended reach across the dusty street, and the quality of the light had gone from the punishing white of midday to something softer, the amber of a late summer afternoon that has surrendered its worst intentions and is now simply beautiful, the way the high plains can be beautiful when they are not trying to kill you, which is a beauty that people who have never lived here do not fully understand, but that people who have cannot look at without feeling it somewhere very specific in the chest. Martha was standing at the end of the wagon looking at the post office porch. The old chair was still there. She did not know if it was the same chair. It might have been. The boards were the same warped gray planking, the same angle of shade from the same roof overhang. She looked at it for a moment with the peculiar, tender irony of a person revisiting a place that was both much smaller and much more significant than its physical dimensions suggested. Jessie came to stand beside her. "You know what I've been thinking about," she said. "Tell me," he said, which were the same words she had used in the barn in the dark, and she was not sure whether he was aware of this or not, but she suspected he was because he was a man who paid attention to things even when he did not advertise the paying. "The post office building," she said. "It's been empty for 2 years. The porch is solid. The interior is salvageable." She looked at it. A proper mending and repair shop, and in time with the water situation stable, something more, a place where people can come with things that are broken and leave with them made whole. She paused. This town needs to not become a ghost town, and a town that is trying to survive needs places where things get fixed. Jessie looked at the building. He did the thing he did when he was genuinely considering something going still in a way that was not the absence of thought, but its presence, the concentration of a man who thinks with his whole attention when something is worth his whole attention. "We'd need to negotiate the lease with the county," he said. "Yes. The roof on the back section needs replacing." "I know, I looked at it that first day." He almost smiled, the full version of it this time, not just the edge. "Of course you did." He looked at her. "All right." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "It's a good idea," he said simply. "You have good ideas. I have noticed this about you." She held his gaze for a moment and felt the thing in her chest that she had been tending, the way she tended everything that was growing with patience and with care, and with the belief that what is properly tended will become what it is meant to be. It was fully grown now. It had been fully grown for some time. She was simply in this moment allowing herself to look at it directly and acknowledge its dimensions. "Jessie," she said. "Martha," he said. "I want you to know something," she said. He waited with the full, unhurried attention he gave to things that mattered. "When I agreed to what you proposed," she said, "on the porch in front of the bank, I told you it was a contract, that it would be treated as one. And it was. But what it became was not what I contracted for." She looked at him steadily. "What it became is something I did not know how to want before I had it, because I had never had anything to measure it against. What it became is mine in a way that nothing has ever been mine before." She paused. "I wanted you to know that I understand the difference, and that I am not confused about which thing this is." Jessie Carter looked at Martha Ellen Crowley in the amber light of the late summer afternoon on the main street of Red Dust Crossing, and whatever was in his expression was everything she had catalogued and kept and understood about him across all the weeks and all the work and all the silences that were never empty. And it was also something beyond all of that, something that simply was what it was, plain and permanent and real, the way the water underground was real, patient and deep, and there all along, waiting only for the right moment and the right movement of the earth to find its way to the surface. He took her hand in the middle of the street, not a dramatic gesture, not a performance. The simple physical fact of his hand around hers, the calloused warmth of it, the easy certainty of it. Two working hands that had learned each other and had decided without discussion and without doubt that this was where they belonged. And then the rain began. It began the way the best things begin, without announcement, without the fanfare that the long waiting seemed to demand. A single drop on the dusty street, dark and immediate and real. Then another. Then a sound on the tin roof of the post office, quiet and irregular, and then less irregular. And then the smell of it, the smell that the high plains give off when rain finally touches the dry earth. A smell that is not like anything else in the world. A deep green smell that comes from the earth releasing what it has been keeping, the mineral memory of water rising into the air like something breathing again after a very long time underwater. Martha turned her face up. She felt the rain on her face, each drop distinct and cool and impossibly present. And she stood in the middle of the street of Red Dust Crossing, with Jessie Carter's hand in hers, and the rain coming down around them, and she did not close her eyes. She kept them open. She wanted to see it. She wanted to see the dust on the street going dark in the pattern of the rainfall. She wanted to see the people coming out of doorways and stopping in the middle of whatever they had been doing to stand in the rain, the way humans stand in rain after a long drought, with their arms slightly out and their faces up, and the particular quality of surrender that is not defeat, but its opposite, the letting go of the braced-against posture that a long, hard season requires, and the allowing of something good to simply be received. She wanted to see Jessie's face with the rain on it, the dark hat going darker with the water, the weathered plains of him going soft in the way that rain softens the hardest landscape, and she wanted to see the look in his eyes when he turned to look at her, which was the look she had learned and kept and would carry for the rest of her life as the truest measure of what she was worth, which was not a measurement in cattle or in coin or in the opinion of any gathering of people in any square under any sun, but the simple and inarguable testimony of a person who had looked at all of her and found it not merely sufficient, but exactly what he needed. The rain came harder. Down Main Street in red dust. Crossing, the water began to move in thin, bright sheets across the packed earth, and the dust rose into the air in that first paradoxical moment of rainfall where the falling water disturbs the dry surface and sends it briefly aloft before the weight of the rain brings it down and holds it down, washing it into the cracks and the low places, beginning the long, patient work of reconstituting the ground. Martha thought about the aquifer under their land, about the water running down the exposed rock face, and replenishing what was already there, about the well that would be sunk, and the spring that would be developed, and the post office building with its solid walls, and its salvageable roof, and its porch, where a woman had once sat down in the worst moment of her public life and picked up her work and refused to be moved. She thought about a root cellar that ran deep, about a garden bed with bean seedlings splitting the soil, about 7 stitches in lamplight and a wrist held gently, and a name said for the first time, about the corner of a barn in the dark with a lantern burning between 2 people and the world coming apart at the seams outside and everything inside, everything that mattered holding. She thought about her father's pocket watch in the small box that sat now on the flat-board shelf in the loft, and the folded paper with the few lines in his handwriting that she had memorized and carried, and that said in the plain language of a plain man who had loved his daughter with an uncomplicated and sufficient love, that the measure of a life is not what you were given, but what you did with the getting up each morning, and that the getting up was the whole of it, the secret and the practice and the reward. She had gotten up every morning. She was still getting up. Jessie's hand tightened slightly around hers, and she tightened hers in return, and they stood together in the rain, while the street of Red Dust Crossing went dark and wet around them, and the sound of the water on the tin roofs built into something sustained and steady and deeply, profoundly real. She was not a joke. She had never been a joke, Though she had let people spend their energy attempting the punchline for longer than she should have, which was the one concession to their definitions that she was willing to admit, and which she was now entirely finished making. She was Martha Ellen Crowley Carter, and she was 30 feet from the porch where she had remade herself in front of a crowd that had tried to reduce her to nothing, and she was standing in the first real rain in months, with the hand of a man who loved her in her hand, and the plan for her life in her chest, and the knowledge, bone deep and permanent, of exactly what she was worth. The rain fell on Red Dust Crossing. The dust settled, and Martha stood in the middle of it, open-eyed and unafraid, and let the good thing be received.